Okay, I think we are live. Thanks everyone for who's already here with us. We're gonna give it a couple more seconds at least for other people to join. And I think then we are ready to roll. We do, so it's the webinar is scheduled for 45 minutes. We do have quite some content to get through. The idea is that we will leave some room for questions in the end. I'm going to get to that in a second. But yeah, I think Lewis, should we get started?
Yeah, happy to. Let's start with intros because I can see people are trickling in still.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, let's give it a go with the intros, Lewis, and then if people join a little later, I think they'll be able to catch up. So, yeah, just again, welcome everybody everyone who's already on. Obviously, very excited to talk about the EU battery regulation with you today. We've got Lewis with us. Lewis, I'll hand over to you to give your own introduction, and then I'll come back to myself.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Lewis. I'm a product compliance expert for the last 15 years, working as a regulator, then working in the private sector for TK Maxx, and now more recently as a consultant.
Awesome. And my name is Jonas. I am one of the directors here at Edge Comply. We work with companies all around the world on product compliance, on this product certification, product safety, and the EU battery regulation is certainly something that's top of mind for many of our clients. So we decided it's time to do a webinar about it. And without further ado, I would say let's get started with some housekeeping. Please feel free to use this little box that you find in the bottom right, I believe, in your chat module or your chat window. You can post your questions throughout the webinar. We recommend you posting them throughout the webinars because sometimes it easily happens that you forget what you wanted to ask, and that way we've got a good overview of everything that we want to cover in the Q&A session. If we don't get to your question in the Q&A session, please still don't be discouraged, don't be disappointed. We'll certainly get back to you after the webinar by email to help you as much as we can. And one thing I want to point out, because sometimes that gets lost towards the end of the webinar, is we do offer a one-on-one chat, a one-on-one call, I should say, with everybody who thinks they would like to have a personal or a more tailored consultation on how to implement the EU battery regulation. I'm going to drop a link in the chat just now. And I think I can't pin it, but I'll just leave it in there. So if you want to book a call with us, feel free to use the link. We'll get back to that later in this webinar. Okay, so the agenda for today is really focused around the updated requirements. We're trying to make it as practical as possible. We're going to start with the scope of the regulation, just so that everybody's clear on what's covered, what battery types are included, and then we'll move on to the basics of the regulation before we then get into this very, very long section around all the different requirements that come with this regulation. As you can tell, I mean, even without me going through this in detail, you can already see that the battery regulation touches on so many different areas, which I believe is one of the reasons why it's causing so much confusion. It's not very targeted in a sense that there's just one or two things that you'll have to change in your business. It really affects the entire life cycle of the battery. It affects the way we are designing batteries, and it affects various safety components of it as well. And then after that, we're going to get to the Q&A. So yeah, as I just quickly, so you have some context on who's giving this webinar, I'll keep this short, I promise. About Edge Comply as a company. So we are a product compliance consulting firm based out of London, UK. We work with a lot of international brands on helping them with EU compliance and international compliance. We have experts such as Lewis all around the world to help our clients make sure they meet different, or they are in line with all the product compliance regulations that exist across markets. And yeah, so that's just quickly on us. We specifically work with small and medium-sized companies, which is also relevant for this webinar. So we'll we'll have some polls that I would like to ask you to participate in about who's on the webinar. But generally speaking, this is targeted at companies below 500 employees, companies that maybe don't yet have a full, a huge compliance department. So just keep that in mind for context on who we are speaking or how we've put together this webinar. Cool. Quick poll so that we get a sense of where everybody stands with regard to the battery regulation. How familiar do you feel you are with the battery regulation? This will help us just to adjust kind of the webinar a little bit, tailor the webinar a little bit to the audience. So I'm going to publish this poll, and then it would be fantastic if you could submit your vote. Are you brand new to the EU regulation, number one? Are you in the process of educating yourself? Do you feel like you're partly compliant, or are you number four, fully compliant? And this is really just about getting the reassurance that you haven't missed anything. So while the votes start coming in, Lewis, what is your feeling about where the market is in terms of how far ahead are companies with implementing this? Yeah, maybe give us your thoughts on that.
It's a real mix of those that have heard about it, maybe attended one or two webinars like this and are starting to understand what it means for them, and some that are partly implementing. If anyone is already fully compliant and on track, I will be incredibly impressed. I will personally issue you with a certificate, not just because you're way ahead of the market, but also some of the requirements are still coming to light as we wait for a bit more guidance, or we wait for things like some of the capacity requirements for batteries to be firmed up as well. But I think that's reflected in the results that are coming through already.
Yeah. Agreed. Most people are saying partly compliant, so that's great. So we're not starting from zero. Let's get started with the regulation scope, just to remind everybody. And I think the key message is really this regulation does not only affect companies selling individual batteries, it affects every company selling battery-containing products. So that's really, really important to understand. The only exemption are military and space applications. I don't think we have any companies on this webinar that fall into this space. So if you sell any products containing batteries, this fully applies to you. The thing that's important to understand is that the regulation differentiates or distinguishes batteries in all these different categories. And we're going to take a closer look at that, just because you'll have these terms come up in the regulation in this webinar and when you speak to other people as well. So we just want to clarify that you are clear on what the different battery types are under this regulation. The most common one, at least among the companies that we tend to interact with, are portable batteries. So those are the batteries that you'll find in your TV remote, in your cell phone, in your power bank. They tend to be small, under 5 kilograms, and again, these are kind of the consumer type batteries that you are probably familiar with. Then this category will certainly also affect some companies on here, light means of transportation, LMT batteries. So those are the types of batteries you find in your e-bikes, scooters. They are heavier than 5 kilograms. They're oftentimes heavier than 5 kilograms and are meant to power or to power vehicles such as the ones mentioned. The less common ones are starting and lighting and ignition batteries. So those are your car starter batteries. You can see an example in this picture here. Industrial batteries, I do think we have maybe one or two participants who fall into this bucket. So those are the types of batteries that you would use, for example, in the data center. They are they are used for industrial purposes. They're heavier than 5 kilograms, or they contribute towards adding energy to the actual electricity grid. And then the last category is electric vehicle batteries, which I don't think that's relevant to anybody here. Lewis, anything I forgot to clarify what's what, or is that pretty clear?
No, I think it's pretty clear. As you say, most people on the call, if not all, are in the portable or light means of transport, the LMT space. So although we will mention some requirements that come in for industrial and others, we're going to focus on portable and LMT for this webinar.
Awesome. I'm going to publish another poll just quickly so that we see what types of batteries everybody has. So if, oh, this one is this one already live? I think it is. Lewis, can you see the battery type poll, or is it just me who can see it? No, it should be there.
It has now gone live, yeah.
Yeah, okay, awesome. So if you could just submit your vote, again, that's helpful to know who's on here. We've got some, so we've got more than 50% are portable. We've got 3 who say they are in the LMT space, and then we've got a few who say industrial EV as well. All right, okay. Lewis, we've got some work to do then on the next couple of slides.
I don't think I studied that page, Jonas, but we'll see. We'll see. We'll touch on it a little bit.
Cool. Yeah, just for whoever is in the EV or in the industrial sector, we'll certainly cover a few points that we'll certainly cover various points that apply to industrial and EV as well. Okay, so with that, let's dive into the foundational knowledge basics of the EU battery regulation. So I want to start with the why the EU battery regulation even exists. I know we want to be very practical, and we're going to get to the practical part as quickly as we can. Nevertheless, sometimes it's helpful to put yourself into the shoes of the policymakers to understand what the purpose of a regulation is. And that's the purpose of this slide. So why does the EU battery regulation matter? We've got the political urgency, which is around aspects such as the fact that battery waste naturally contributes towards high CO2 emissions. Climate change is one of the consequences. There's also actual health risks, not only environmental and pollution risks, but health risks from the hazardous metals in batteries. And that's something that the EU is determined to tackle with this regulation. One interesting motive that the EU has communicated as well is that the goal of the battery regulation is basically to increase the EU autonomy by having a heavier focus on recyclability of the materials in batteries, so that the EU as a whole, as an economy, does not exclusively rely on importing those rare metals, which obviously don't exist too much in the EU itself. It's also about human rights issues in relation to mining those metals, so supply chain related aspects. And then again, the safety hazard aspect. There's one example, one interesting stat I think that's worth mentioning. In New York City itself, there have been more than 1,000 fires from e-bike batteries since 2019. Lewis has just recently been involved in a product recall related to a battery that overheated. So as you can see, there's all these different aspects that have contributed towards the creation of the EU battery regulation. For us as manufacturers, brands, business owners, what this means is that the business impact and the risks are down here. So there is fines up to 4% of annual turnover. That's a very common penalty size or penalty that the EU gives out. So that applies here as well. You risk being rejected at imports. And then at the same time, what we always like to emphasize is, while at first it's always annoying to deal with these new regulations, it's also an opportunity for every brand to increase their safety standards, increase their quality standards, and increase their supply chain resilience. So I think the smart brands, the smart manufacturers use these new regulations as a chance to innovate themselves and don't just see it as another hurdle to get through. There's a real... So in terms of liability, I think one thing that's also important to point out is, for everybody who's on here, no matter in which role you work at your company, whether you're an employee, a technician, or a board member, or business owner, there is personal liability involved if you don't comply with the regulations such as the EU battery regulation. The EU is very clear about that. We have this little chart down here that just indicates how your risk level evolves as you continuously move up the hierarchy within an organization. So the higher you are in an organization, obviously the higher your personal liability risk is. And we don't mention this to scare anybody. We just mention it because I think sometimes it's overlooked, and especially in larger organizations, it's easy to forget about the fact that at the end of the day, you are still, as an employee, as somebody involved in product safety, liable for the things that might go wrong with something like a battery. Cool. Quick timeline of some major milestones regarding the EU battery regulation. So officially, the EU battery regulation entered into force in 2023, so already quite a while ago. But then there was this phased implementation, which is why we're seeing many companies only coming to terms with the new regulation, or coming to realize what the implications actually are this year, and many will probably still have to do some catch-up work even over the next couple of years. Key milestones that were hit so far in 2024. So about 1 year ago, we saw those new CE requirements come into effect. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So you have to have CE marks on your batteries, which because this requirement applies, you also have to update your DOCs, which is something we'll talk about in a bit more detail. And then this year, what we're seeing is a big focus on stricter labeling rules. So we've got various performance information, general information that need to be on your battery itself. This is gradually being implemented this year and next year. As of 2027, moving on to this point, we've got requirements around the passport, the digital battery passport that you probably have heard of, and replaceability requirements. Very, very important, because that's going to impact design decisions already today. So it's really important to be aware of this. And then 2028 and moving forward, there's going to be stricter requirements around recyclability, or the percentage of recycled materials in the batteries that you sell. So yeah, this is just a quick high-level overview of where we are at. Lewis, anything to add here, or do you think we should rather?
Just that for 2027, those of you who are involved in LMT batteries or the EV batteries, 2027 is a key year where lots of these requirements, like you've touched on, the digital battery passport, sustainability and beyond, start to come into force. So that's a key date.
Cool. Okay, and with this, we're going to move into the practical implications of the battery regulation, and we're going to start off with the need for removability and replaceability of batteries. And again, this is about very much impacting design decisions of brands already today. The key requirement is that batteries, and that includes portable batteries and LMT batteries, must easily be removable and user replaceable. So that's something that's going to come into force in 2027. Yeah, I'm pausing that, Lewis. I know you've got some thoughts on this. Maybe you want to elaborate on this, but this obviously is a massive change, and easily overlooked, I believe. So I think many brands will only wake up to this in 2027 when it's already too late.
Definitely. Yeah, the exemptions are so small. So you've touched on them there on the slide. But I know there was a real push in the mobile phone sector to try and get an exemption for them, but they were kind of largely unsuccessful. Some of you might be aware of mobile phone brands like Fairphone that design their products so that various components, including the battery, can easily be removed and replaced by the user. That's sort of the direction of travel. But yeah, for all pretty much all battery products except for certain medical devices and those listed, the user does need to be able to access and replace the battery, or at least have an independent professional be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think this one, the second point, spare parts, just to emphasize this one as well. So spare parts must be available for over 5 years after the last unit is placed on the EU market. Again, something to be aware of, that this is real and this is going to come into force in 2027. Yes. So, and you touched on the exemptions. Maybe one thing to add is this point, and Lewis, you alluded to that. So there was a chance for companies to submit derogations. So in other words, submitting requests for getting an exemption earlier this year. This deadline has now passed, and we've seen that many companies have been unsuccessful with it, such as the phone companies.
Just to add on the spare parts in practice. So if you are an importer into the EU, This means that you'll need to make sure that you work with the manufacturer or a spare parts supplier so that you as the importer can fulfill your legal obligations. If you're a manufacturer, a brand in the EU, then that falls on you to make sure that there is that access to spare parts from users, from repairers as well.
Okay, cool. Yep, let's move on to the next section, which is label requirements. So this slide is quite long because there's quite a number of updates that you have to be aware of. So we've already mentioned that since last year, you have to have a CE mark on the battery. And maybe, Lewis, can you just say something about the placement of the CE mark? So it needs to be on the battery itself. Is that correct?
Yeah, on the battery, it's very unlikely that there's kind of going to be a real justification to not have it on the battery. So on the battery, the usual height rules apply, so a minimum of 5 millimeters. And in many cases, you're already going to have a CE mark on your batteries because of the RoHS or Roche regulation. And now that CE mark is also going to be for the EU batteries regulation.
The QR code and digital battery passport, those two terms are often used interchangeably. There's no date here, but this will apply as of 2027. So keep that in mind when you're reading this. We're going to get to this on a separate slide in more detail. Since last month, you have to have this crossed bin symbol, and Lewis, it's this one down here. I think that we can see, right? That needs to be on batteries. Lewis and we had a little argument about whether this, because we thought this was already a requirement that existed anyway. But I think now this argument is resolved because there's no way around it. It has to be on the battery. So yeah, that's key and something to be aware of. And with all these labeling requirements, maybe just to say something about this, while I would say the risk of getting fined a substantial amount of money tends to be higher for things that are directly safety related. Obviously, some of these things are directly safety related, but if you have a serious safety concern, or if there's a serious safety risk with your battery and that you are aware of, and you still put it in the market, that obviously could cause a tremendous amount of financial harm because of penalties. But with these label requirements, something I like to point out is that these things are usually very low-hanging fruits for you to fix quickly, and they are also things that are very easy to check for customs or regulators. So that's why these label requirements, even if they seem small, it's just negligent or unnecessary to ignore them. So maybe just as a general comment on label requirements. You have to provide info on how to remove and replace the battery. So I think this goes hand in hand with what we've just talked about with regard to the removability and replaceability. So this regulation also applies as of 2027, unless you say something different, Lewis, but that's my understanding of this. So, and then this one, hazardous substance marking if certain limits exceeded. This is something that there are limits defined in the EU battery regulation. We can look them up for you if you need them to, or you can look them up yourselves. As of which, once you exceed them, you have to mark your product with the chemical symbol of the element that's exceeding the limit.
Just to add, in practice, there's separate limits for how much of these substances you can have in your product, and a threshold over and above which you must add a label. In reality, this only really applies to lead. For cadmium and mercury, the limits are the same, i.e. you can't have more, so you'll never need a label. But for lead, realistically, that could be something you need to declare on your label.
The general and performance info is pretty broad, so there's some updates around what needs to be on there. We can quickly go through this list. So the battery type, chemistry, batch serial number needs to be on there. The date of manufacturing needs to be on there. For rechargeable batteries, you need to have the capacity on there. For non-rechargeable batteries, the minimum average duration plus the little hint, it's non-rechargeable. So Yeah, so that's on label requirements. Let's move on to recycled content and material targets. This will keep a little shorter because it's only applicable to EV, industrial, and SLI batteries that contain any of these chemicals. So, and it's a little further out. So again, because it's further out, there's still a chance that the EU may change something about the exact requirements. But as it stands, as of 2028, you need to include info about when you sell your battery or your product that shows the percentage of the recycled metals in your battery. And as of 2020, at 2031, which is in 6 years, you will need to meet these minimum recycled content thresholds. And again, this is what it currently says. It's possible that this will still be adjusted, but at the moment, these are the targets. And obviously, if you will have the awareness that that's currently not, you're currently very far away from these targets, then now is the time to make the necessary adjustments in your supply chain, in your designs, to try to get there as much as to get as close to those numbers as possible. Cool. I'm going to move on, Lewis, I think, just because it's a rather niche and far out topic, to the CE specific. We could have named this product safety compliance, this slide as well. And this is applicable to all batteries. And there's a variety of, again, CE specific updates that you have to be aware of, plus product safety conformity topics. So I'm going to let you elaborate on this first one, Lewis, because at this point seems a little bit vague, stricter conformity assessment process. So what's meant by this?
Yes, so at the moment for batteries, there isn't really a conformity assessment process. And what we mean by that is anyone who produces things like electric scooters, other electrical products, knows that there's a process you have to go through before you can put that CE mark on your product. So starting with a risk assessment, looking at all of the potential hazards, making sure you reduce those to the minimum, compiling all of your technical documentation. This didn't exist until this new EU battery regulation for the battery specifically. So there is a clear process that you need to follow for the battery. And the idea is to make them safer and to improve compliance levels.
Cool. So one of the specific requirements that is worth mentioning are the tougher limits on certain metals in the battery. So we've got an updated limit for how much mercury, cadmium, and lead is allowed in the battery. And you can see those numbers here in percentage. Again, if you don't have visibility into this, then it's very important that you do gain visibility into this through either testing or obtaining the necessary documentation. You touched on technical documentation already, Lewis. So technical documentation is, again, something that's very common for any product that requires CE marking already anyway. It's just that the need for this is now extended, again, for the battery. And the same thing, we can say the same thing about the DOC, the Declaration of Conformity, which a common pitfall that we see is that companies that sell, let's take the scooter as an example, do not update their DOC they have a DOC for the scooter and that DOC was compliant up until 2024, but now that there's a need for the CE marking of the actual battery, that those DOCs need to be updated. And otherwise, if that's not the case, you risk your goods being stopped at customs, because the DOC is obviously one of the first things that customs and market authorities look at. The last point, responsible entity, is required within the EU. A concept that's already very well known from regulations such as the General Product Safety Regulation and other CE regulations. You need to have a responsible person in the EU. If you are not an EU company, if you are an EU company, that's naturally you. Or most of the time it's you, at least for the audience that's on this webinar. If you are a non-EU company, then you need to have some EU responsible person, which, by the way, could be Edge Comply. Yeah, so is there any, Lewis, is there anything specific about the responsible entity in this context compared to what we know from other CE regulations or the General Product Safety Regulation?
It's really closely aligned with GPSR. So it just means if anyone has a GPSR responsible person, they need to update that agreement with them and ask them to also be the responsible economic operator for the EU battery regulation as well. Just a couple of things to add on technical documentation and DOCs. I can see that Lena has asked a question in the chat about do we need to update the DOCs already, the declarations of conformity. Absolutely, this requirement has already come in around CE marking and DOCs. So you would need to add the new EU battery regulation to your DOCs. And when we talk about technical documentation, we're talking about things like the risk assessment that I mentioned earlier, any sustainability documentation you might already have, design drawings, supplier information, all of that, and it can be stored digitally.
Awesome. Thanks, Luis. Cool. So this next slide is about the digital battery passport and the QR code that you'll all need to have. We kept this fairly light because, first of all, there's still a little bit of clarification that's needed from the EU to really know what's going to come down the regulatory pipeline. But also we thought it's best maybe to verbalize some of these things. So from February 2027, the EU is very clear that EV, industrial, and LNT batteries must have a digital battery passport. All batteries need a QR code that repeats mandatory labels. So we had this labeling slide earlier, and basically this QR code is supposed to link you to those information as well, so that you can look them up digitally as well. Luis, if you could enlighten us a little bit about the difference between the digital battery passport and just the QR code. Yeah, that would be great.
I'll try, because this is a bit tricky. So on the QR code, as Jonas has just said, this is for all types of battery from February 2027. This will link to the mandatory labeling that we shared, and you have the option to link to a digital copy of your declaration of conformity. That isn't mandatory. If you are in the business of EV, industrial, and LMT batteries, like some on the call, there will be the requirement for this digital battery passport. In addition to that mandatory labeling, this is where you're going to have information such as supply chain information, carbon footprint, performance and durability metrics, and it's mandatory to upload your DOC to a digital format as well. Many on the call will be familiar that there's a push in the EU towards digital product passports, slightly different to battery passports. It will be possible, we believe, to merge the two so that you have your battery passport and your product passport information all accessible through this QR code, and then a page that allows consumers to click into whatever information they want to access.
Yeah, cool. That's helpful, and yeah, I think that's what we are all hoping for, that's going to get merged, because otherwise we'll all be, even as consumers, it's going to be a lot of QR codes, and then we'll have to keep scanning. Awesome. Performance and durability is another area that we wanted to briefly touch on. So there is a clear, as we are pointing out here, the exact requirements are still to be finalized, but generally speaking, what's foreseeable is that there's going to be requirements around the minimum capacity and percentage of the full capacity or the original capacity after a certain amount or a certain number of charge-discharge cycles. And similarly, there's also going to be requirements about the allowed performance drop. So what's the difference between these two? The difference is essentially that this capacity and percentage is very objective. This performance drop, what we mean by that is whatever you are claiming, it needs to be able to keep up that performance up to a certain number of charge and discharge cycles. So with this, we're almost getting into the space of the realm of marketing and claims compliance. But yeah, it's obviously very closely intertwined. Anything you want to add here, Luis, or is this, should we leave it at this?
No, I think you summarized it nicely.
Okay, awesome. Cool. Then we've got one slide about supply chain obligations. This one's an interesting one because there is still so much to, well, first of all, there are certain thresholds that you have to be aware of, and certain things only apply to certain battery types. So this one's a little bit complicated, but we'll try to simplify it for you as much as we can. So under supply chain obligations, we've decided to put these two requirements, these two major buckets, which are due diligence and carbon footprinting or carbon footprint tracking. The due diligence, as you can imagine what this means, and we alluded to this earlier, is about making sure that you have responsible sourcing in place, that within your supply chain there's no environmental or a social harm that's being done. Especially think of the usual things you would have in mind when you think of this, such as child labor or any forced labor. And this applies to companies over 40 million euros in turnover. Now they are considering, there is a proposal this threshold gets raised, but this is still to be decided. Nevertheless, we think, yeah, even if you are below that threshold, this exercise of, and sorry, I'm jumping down here to this little mini diagram. This exercise of mapping your supply chain, performing a risk assessment on these environmental, social risk aspects, and then mitigating those risks is something that you should implement as a company, as a responsible company anyway. There is not this requirement around supply chain due diligence is something that comes up in so many different regulations. There's the EU deforestation regulation, which obviously it doesn't apply to many of the people on the call, but there's so many other regulations that require you to have a good understanding of how your supply chain looks like. And therefore, we strongly recommend that you do this exercise, especially if you have few suppliers. It's fairly feasible. You don't need any fancy software, in our opinion, to necessarily do it. It's really about just doing a little bit of homework there for companies that are smaller. For larger companies, obviously, it's a different story. So what exactly, apart from this, is required? Well, you need to have a due diligence policy in place that you need to make available to authorities if they request it. And the EU Commission, just as a hint, is going to publish a more specific guidance in July 2026. So keep an eye out for that. Should I move on to carbon footprinting, Lewis? Or do you want to add something up here to this?
Nothing to add at the moment.
Cool. So carbon footprint tracking, this applies to EV, industrial, and LMT batteries. So you need to, if you don't already do it, you need to start collecting life cycle assessment data, meaning you need to get clear around CO2 that's being produced, generated, exhausted throughout your supply chain, throughout the life cycle, in fact, of your products. And what you'll then need to do is you need to compile that data that you get from this exercise and compile so-called declarations. So you have to compile declarations in which you state how much carbon or CO2 you've put out. And you also have to apply your carbon footprint that's expected to your labels. Again, this one's a little bit more vague than the other requirements because this one's still being implemented. But as of 2027, 2028, this is becoming more concrete. And I mean, so I'm going to leave it to.
I think we might have lost Jonas's camera, unless that's just me. We'll give it a few seconds and hopefully he'll come back. Jonas, you back with us? So apologies about this. If you're not able to hear Jonas, just like me, slight technical issue. I hope you will come back. I'm not able to control the slides, I don't think. I will just have a look into that while we wait for him to rejoin. maybe use this opportunity just to pop any additional questions into the questions function. I can see that Jonas has just rejoined, so hopefully we'll be back on track in just a second.
Can you hear me, Lewis?
Yes, you are back, Jonas.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much for bridging that awkward gap.
Maybe I should insert a joke about maybe it's a battery that's not compliant with the battery regulation in terms of performance. That's a compliance joke. Over to you.
So before we get into Q&A, let me just quickly, you can see the slides, I believe, right?
Yep, we can.
Cool. So yeah, let me just finish it off because this is the last time we can do Q&A. What are your next steps? This is our suggested roadmap. The first step, educate yourself. Well, you've basically done this by joining webinars like this one, done a little bit of your own research. Many of you have said you've started implementing certain things. Our suggestion is use the chance to speak to consultants, like in this case, Lewis, for example. I'm going to share the link again to the Calendly or the calendar scheduling page, so you can schedule a call with us. It's the easiest way for you to get more tailored advice on all of this, in case some of your questions don't get answered. And then beyond that, what we are seeing is the successful brands that are managing to be on top of the battery regulation or any other regulation is there's clear responsibility within a company for who's taking ownership of this topic, and whether that's somebody internal or somebody outsourced like Edge Compliant, both options are valid, but that's just very important because otherwise things get lost between departments here very easily. And then map out exactly, I'm going down to point number 4 here, map out exactly what the requirements mean. I think one of the key things that we've managed to emphasize or convey is that there's so many different deadlines, there's so many different battery types. So figuring out what exactly is the roadmap for you is quite the exercise. We hope this was helpful, but there's still work to be done on your end regardless. And then address those immediate issues that are easy to fix, for example, labeling, CE documentation, and then prepare all those longer term obligations, such as the design changes and so forth. Lewis, I'm going to hand over to you to comment on the questions that we've received, if that's okay.
Of course, yes. We've had some in the chat and some in the questions function, which I think will apply to several people on the call. So I will rattle through them as quickly as I can. So we've had a question from Frederick about the requirement for products that are designed to be replaced once every 10 years and have a long life battery, such as smoke detectors. So Frederick, there is an exemption for if the product is designed to last more than 10 years and it contains a battery, for example, a non-replaceable battery that lasts at least 10 years, and you can evidence that, and that's crucial. You must be able to evidence its durability for more than the 10 years. Then there is an exemption in terms of the replaceability of that battery. We've had another question from Stephen. He asked, I think, during the labeling slide, and I think all battery capacities are only over 2000 watt. I think on that slide, the requirements are for all batteries, unless Jonas indicated with a little bracket, for example. We've already answered Lena's question about updating DOCs. Over in the questions function, Simone has asked about easily removable in the context of e-bikes. So let me try and make this simple. So the general rule is that a battery must be easily removable, which means the end user can access it, remove it with standard tools, so not proprietary tools, and they're given information both in writing and through the QR code from 2027 on how to remove and replace it. If there are safety, performance, or other reasons why an end user can't do that themselves, or for example, if they need to remove the motor in order to access that battery, then you can rely on one of the Article 11 exemptions. So what does that mean? That means that you still need to make sure that independent professionals can remove and replace that battery. So you can't just use your own kind of repairing kind of service or your own chosen partners. Independent repairers must be able to get hold of the battery replacements from you, be able to access the information about how to replace it, and be able to do that. So I hope I've answered your question there. Have I got time for one or two more, Jonas?
Please go ahead. Yeah, I think the bottleneck is whether people are happy to stay on, but I think we'll just keep going.
Of course, I've got a couple more. I can answer those nice and quick. So Sergey, I hope I have pronounced your name correctly, has asked about power banks, car jump starters. Are they a portable battery? Are they a product containing a battery? So they're both really. So if we think about power banks that we all have, and there's been lots of recalls recently for power banks, or car jump starters that have a battery, the battery inside, or the collection of cells inside, is your portable battery. Then they are fitted in a product containing a battery. So the requirements we spoke about earlier, things like a CE mark, that you must have your EU battery regulation CE mark on the battery itself. You must have the labeling on the battery itself. Then there's all the existing requirements that apply to the overall product. So your product might fall under ROSH. Depending on what it is, it might fall under radio equipment, low voltage, things like electric scooters or radio equipment. So those are unchanged. You just have to update your DOC for the whole product to include the EU battery regulation. So I hope that answers. Just to summarize, the battery inside is the portable battery. Your whole product is a product containing a portable battery. And there's a question from Lena about specific harmonized standards for e-bikes and others. So there are some standards being developed or considered to become harmonized standards. So that's the gold standard of standards. That process hasn't completed just yet. It's if you're already using EN standards or IEC standards for your e-bikes and the batteries attached to them, it's quite likely they will just become harmonized for this purpose as well. Standards are being developed for things like carbon footprint. So how do you calculate carbon footprint? And there's a couple of others as well. And I think there's another sustainability one that's being considered at the moment. So stay tuned to see what those harmonized standards are. EN 15194. For sure, I know off the top of my head, is one of those that's suitable to use. I think I have got a quick note. I'll just try and refer on the spot. Yes, so 15194, EN 50604 are all ones that you can do. And yes, others are being developed. Oh, that was it. So carbon footprint, recycled content, how you verify that, and the performance durability cycle testing, they're all being developed. So we'll see those announced as harmonized soon. And I think, Jonas, unless I've missed anyone, really sorry, I think I've answered all of the questions that have come in.
No, I think you have managed to get through all of them. So thanks so much, everybody, for joining. We hope it was helpful. Again, if you have any more questions, the easiest way to get in touch is by just booking a call with us. But yeah, until next time we discuss another fun regulation or the battery regulation in maybe a year or so, when things have clarified a little bit further for what's coming in 2027 and beyond. So yeah, thanks, Lewis, for being so helpful, and
Pleasure.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.